You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
Welcome back to the Occult Rejects. This is part 2 of the life of Giordano Bruno. I hope you all enjoyed part 1, and if you haven't listened to that yet, I suggest you do before you listen to this. And now, let's continue off where we left off in part 1. By 1591, Bruno had spent over a decade crisis crossing Europe. He was famous in intellectual circles but had failed to find a secure patron or haven. In Frankfurt in spring of 1591, at the Frankfurt Book Fair, Bruno met a Venetian patrician named Giovanni Mocenigo. Mocenigo, an aristocrat with an interest in esoteric knowledge, invited Bruno to Venice to tutor him in the arts of memory and perhaps share occult secrets. At the same time, Bruno heard that the prestigious University of Padua, near Venice, was looking to fill its chair of mathematics, a position left vacant by the recent death of a luminary. This was a golden opportunity. Padua was one of the foremost universities in Europe. Soon it would hire Galileo for that very chair. Believing, perhaps, that the climate in Italy had softened, Pope Sixtus V, known as a hardliner, had died in 1590, and Venice in particular was known for a relative independence from Rome. Bruno made the fateful decision to return to Italy. He later claimed that he thought the Inquisition would be less strict in Venice, reputedly the most liberal state in Italy. In August of 1591, after 15 years abroad, Giordano Bruno came back to Italian soil. Bruno first spent a few months at Padua in late 1591. He lectured privately in geometry and Aristotelian philosophy and even taught some German students there. He applied for the math professorship, offering his expertise in the art of memory and Copernican cosmology. But in early 1592, the Padua position was instead awarded to a less controversial figure, a young mathematics tutor named Galileo. Disappointed, Bruno accepted Mocenigo's invitation and moved into Mocenigo's palace in Venice in March 1592. For about 2 months, Bruno lived comfortably as Mocenigo's private tutor, imparting his knowledge of mnemonic techniques and discussing philosophy. However, Bruno's candid discourse soon alarmed the host. Mocenigo became disillusioned. Perhaps Bruno's memory training did not produce the quick results he hoped for. Or perhaps Bruno divulged in some theological views that he did not agree with. On May 22, 1592, Giovanni Mocenigo betrayed his houseguest. He denounced Giordano Bruno to the Venetian Inquisition, providing a list of heretical statements Bruno had allegedly made. Bruno was arrested in Venice on May 23, 1592, and thrown into the Inquisition's prison. Among the numerous charges Mocenigo leveled were that Bruno disbelieved core Catholic doctrines, the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, and the virginity of Mary, and that he saw nothing wrong in renouncing the Catholic faith, that he had trafficked in magic, and that he had held the belief in a plurality of worlds and their eternity. It was a sweeping condemnation of Bruno's worldview. Over the next 7 months, the Venetian Holy Office interrogated Bruno. Bruno behaved cooperatively at first. He saw a chance to argue his case in a relative open-minded court. Venice often prided itself on handling its own affairs, and its Inquisition was considered milder than Rome's. Bruno defended himself skillfully, denying some charges outright and presenting others as philosophical speculations rather than fixed heresies. For example, on the accusation of believing in multiple worlds, Bruno admitted he had entertained the idea as a philosopher, but with the reservation that I would not hold the defendant against the Holy Scriptures, trying to placate the examiners by drawing a line between philosophy and theology. Bruno stressed that in question of faith, he accepted church doctrine, and that where he had doubted, for instance, about certain aspects of Catholic dogma, he had done so only hypothetically. These careful equivocations nearly saved him. In fact, the Venetian inquisitors seemed somewhat persuaded. One report suggests they were inclined to be lenient or even release Bruno with a warning, since his ideas were in the realm of philosophy and had not been publicly preached as religious doctrine. The situation took a dire turn when the Roman Inquisition, far less sympathetic, intervened. In September of 1592, the Holy Office in Rome, prompted by testimony against Bruno that hand-trickled down from previous stops, Geneva and other places, demanded Bruno's extradition to Rome. For months, the Venetian government resisted handing him over, perhaps reflecting Venice's independence streak and some support for Bruno among Venetian intellectuals. Bruno himself wrote to the Venetian Senate, arguing that his case should remain in Venice. But in January of 1593, Venice bowed to pressure, possibly fearing offending the powerful Pope Clement VIII. Bruno was sent under guard to Rome to face the full might of the Roman Inquisition. Giordano Bruno spent the last 7 years of his life in the prisons of the Roman Inquisition. He was incarcerated in the Tower of Nona in Rome, in a small cell while his trial dragged on. The Inquisition, led by the formidable Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, collected evidence and witness testimonies from all over Europe to build an airtight case. Unfortunately, many trial documents were later lost. Some resurfaced only in the 20th century, but enough remained to reconstruct the outline. The charges against Bruno had crystallized into eight main accusations, enumerated by the inquisitors. According to the summary, rediscovered in 1940 by scholar Luigi Firpo, Bruno was accused of 1. Holding opinions contrary to the Catholic faith and speaking against church authority. 2. Holding erroneous opinions about the Trinity, Christ's divinity, and incarnation. 3. Holding erroneous opinions about Jesus as Christ, perhaps denying that Christ was God-man. 4. Holding erroneous opinions about the Virgin Mary and the saints. 5. Holding erroneous opinions about transubstantiation, the Eucharist. And 6. Claiming the existence of plurality of worlds and their eternity, an infinite universe. 7. Believing in metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls, reincarnation into animals. And 8. Dealing in magic and divination. In short, Bruno was accused of being a heretic on virtually every count: the nature of God, Christ, and the cosmos, the sacraments, the afterlife, and involvement in occult arts. Before the Roman Inquisition, Bruno initially continued his tactic of partial compliance. Throughout 1593 and 1599, he was repeatedly examined. He answered many questions and sought to explain or contextualize his writings. He acknowledged that he had speculated about an infinite universe and multiple worlds, but argued these were philosophical conjectures not intended to contradict Scripture. He denied believing in magic in any heretical sense, claiming his magic was natural, linked to memory and imagination, not demonology. He tried to separate himself from the Lutheran and Calvinist heresies, emphasizing that he had never adopted their doctrines. Indeed, he's been excommunicated by them. However, the inquisitors, especially Cardinal Bellarmine, were not satisfied. They pressed Bruno to formally recant all his suspected heresies. In January of 1599, the Inquisition drew up a document summarizing Bruno's heretical propositions. Unfortunately, this document is lost now, but it contained 8 propositions extracted from his works and testimony. Bruno was told to abjure, solemnly recant, these propositions or face condemnation. Initially, Bruno stalled. On January 14th, 1599, he was asked if he would abjure. He requested time to consider. 4 days later, brought before the inquisitors, Bruno declared that he did wish to hold what the Holy Church holds, effectively offering to recant, but crucially with the qualification that he did not believe he had ever erred. In other words, he was willing to submit to the church's judgment, but would not explicitly confess to teaching heresy. He even prepared written defenses justifying his philosophical positions as not contrary to faith. This maneuver, trying to concede without truly conceding, had worked for Bruno before, as in Venice, but Bellarmine saw through it, regarding Bruno's half-recantations as obstinacy. In December of 1599, the trial approached its end. The inquisitors gave Bruno one final opportunity to repent plainly. This time, Bruno did not equivocate. Perhaps deciding he could not sacrifice his integrity, he refused to recant outright. On December 21st, 1599, when pressed yet again to abjure, Bruno defied his judges. "I neither ought to recant, nor will I. I have nothing to recant, and I don't know what I should recant." With this stubborn retort, Bruno sealed his fate. The Inquisition tribunal, which included theologians from various orders, among them Bruno's own Dominican order, unanimously declared him impotent and relapsed, a heretic beyond hope of reform. Whew. They petitioned Pope Clement VIII for permission to proceed to sentencing. On January 20th, 1600, the Inquisition, with the Pope's approval, formally condemned Giordano Bruno to death as an obstinate heretic. He was to be handed over to the secular authorities. The inquisitors also decreed that all of Bruno's works, in manuscript or print, were to be placed on the index of prohibited books and destroyed. According to a dispatch by a German witness, the scholar Gaspar Schopp, when the sentence was announced in the courtroom, Bruno responded with legendary courage. He is reported to have told the judge, in English, "Perhaps you who pronounce this sentence are in greater fear than I who receive it." This defiant quip, basically Bruno telling the inquisitors that their consciences should tremble more than his, may be apocryphal. Schopp was not an eyewitness to Bruno's final words, but he heard rumors. True or not, it has become the most famous quote attributed to Bruno, encapsulating his fearless challenge to authority. On February 17th, 1600, in the early dawn, Giordano Bruno was taken from his cell. The civil authorities, the governor of Rome, led him to the Campo di Fiori, a public square not far from the Tiber. As was customary for one convicted of heresy, Bruno's tongue was bound, clamped with an iron gag, to prevent him from addressing the crowd or shouting out any blasphemies. He was stripped naked and then tied to a wooden stake. A lay brotherhood, whose duty was to attend executions, chanted litanies for his soul. Piled high around him were wooden bundles. With a final order, the executioners lit the pyre. Giordano Bruno was burned alive in the flames, faithful to his ideas until his last breath. He was approximately 52 years old. After his body was consumed by fire, the remnants of ash and bone were collected and scattered into the river Tiber, so that no relic would remain. The church aimed to erase Bruno's physical presence and memory, but in this it failed. Bruno's martyrdom, the fact that a theologian, philosopher, and scientist was executed by fire in the year 1600, sent shockwaves through the intellectual community of Europe. All of Bruno's books were banned in Catholic territories by 1603, but clandestine copies survived, and his name took on a life of its own. Even at the moment of his death, Bruno's legacy began to form. A witness described that Bruno, faced with the crucifix one last time by a monk, turned his head away with disdain, a final gesture of refusal. His executioners sought to silence him, but in doing so they amplified his message. Bruno became, in the eyes of later generations, a symbol of the freedom of thought against the coercion of dogma. As the plaque now embedded in the Roman square notes, his ashes were thrown to the winds, but his ideas were not extinguished. One cannot understand Giordano Bruno without delving into his mystical and occult interests. Bruno was not a scientist in the modern sense. He was a philosopher-magician of the Renaissance, deeply influenced by Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and the Kabbalistic tradition. In Bruno's era, the study of magic and natural philosophy were often entwined. Bruno truly believed that the hidden knowledge from antiquity, the wisdom of the ancient magi, could expand understanding and even confer powers. He was the heir to the Renaissance tradition of Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who had revived interest in the legendary Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus and other pre-Christian sources of wisdom. Ficino taught that the ancient theologians, Zoroaster, Hermes, Orpheus, Pythagoras, Plato, had a glimpse of divine truth that culminated in Christianity. Bruno took this idea further, and in a subversive direction. He argued that much of what passed as Christian truth in his time was actually a corruption of the true ancient wisdom. He called Aristotle, the cornerstone of scholastic theology, the stupidest of all philosophers for having distorted the original mystical insights of the ancients. Bruno dreamed of restoring this lost primordial wisdom. In his view, the Egyptians, as known through Hermetic text, and the Pythagoreans had known profound truths about the universe and God which later philosophers had obscured. This veneration of ancient occult wisdom led Bruno to esoteric practices. He immersed himself in Kabbalah and astral magic. While in the Dominican convent, he had read mystical works by Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa and others, picking up ideas about natural magic. The belief that the knowledgeable can manipulate natural forces through symbols, chants, and correspondences. Bruno believed that magic was not demonic, but a part of nature's hidden potential. In his dialogues and later Latin treatises, Bruno portrays magicians as wise men attuned to the unity of nature. One of Bruno's key magical pursuits was the art of memory, which he had demonstrated to kings and scholars. Far from being a mere mnemonic trick, Bruno considered it a magical art, a way to penetrate the structure of reality by impressing images on the mind. He devised elaborate memory systems that involved constructing mental memory wheels or theaters filled with symbolic images, often planetary gods, zodiacal signs, or geometric figures. By mentally rotating and permuting these images, Bruno claimed one could recall anything and also discover new connections between ideas. Bruno's contemporaries often suspected sorcery in his mnemonic feats. King Henry III has noted directly asked if Bruno's memory was natural or acquired by magic. Bruno insisted it was organized knowledge, not sorcery, yet there was an undeniably mystical aspect to his approach. He believed by using planet images and symbols, one could tap into the deeper patterns of the cosmos and the soul. In Bruno's cosmology, mind, nature, and image were all linked, a truly hermetic view. Thus, Bruno's memory art was also occult, a way to achieve union with the universe's intellect. This blending of mental training and magic is a hallmark of Bruno's uniqueness. Bruno's later treatises in Germany delve even more explicitly into magic. In Theses de Magia from 1589, he outlines different categories of magic and magical operations, arguing that a magus is essentially a natural philosopher who understands the secrets of nature. He sees magic as extending the powers of the mind and will. Bruno analyzes how emotions and imaginations can create bonds between people or between people and objects, knowledge critical for both magicians and rulers. For instance, love can bind a person stronger than any chain. A skilled magus can use a beloved image or an idea to control others. This work is sometimes considered an early treatise on psychological influence or even crowd manipulation. It is both disconcerting and insightful, showing Bruno's keen understanding of human nature. Bruno was particularly fascinated by Hermetic symbols and Egyptian religion. He believed the Egyptians, in venerating the stars and formulating enigmatic hieroglyphs, were closer to the divine truth than his Christian contemporaries. In Spazio della Bestia, he has Egyptian goddess Isis appear as a character, And in other works, he extols Hermes Trismegistus as a font of ancient theology. Bruno reversed the common Christian view by suggesting that Moses had learned from Hermes, not the other way around. Such claims were theologically outrageous, effectively subverting the uniqueness of biblical revelation. Bruno's reverence for pantheistic and animistic ideas also stemmed from his occult outlook. He advocated a form of Egyptian religion that would be free of what he saw as the superstitions and petty rules of his era's Christianity. Unsurprisingly, the Inquisition found these views abhorrent, seeing Bruno as a giant syncretist who mixed paganism and Christianity into a dangerous heretical cocktail. To Bruno, religion and morality should be based on philosophical truth, not blind faith. He often criticized the corruption of priests and the emphasis on external worship. He was not exactly an atheist. He often spoke of God, but his God was not the personal God of the Bible. It was more like the soul of the universe, an infinite divine presence manifest in everything, what one might call pantheism. God is in all things, Bruno taught, as the soul is in every part of the body, a notion echoing the Hermetic dictum, God is a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere, also adopted by Nicholas of Cusa earlier. Bruno's idea of libertas philosophica, the freedom to philosophize, was grounded in his conviction that seeking truth through whatever means, reason, experience, even magic, is the highest task of the mind. He held that no authority should bar the pursuit of truth, even if it leads to ideas not accepted by faith, as he argued in Venice. This attitude, deeply rooted in his mystical confidence that the universe reveals itself to the bold thinker, made Bruno a martyr figure for later ages. In summary, Bruno's mysticism and occultism were not mere side hobbies. They were at the heart of his philosophy. He envisioned the universe as a living, unified whole, animated by a divine spirit. He saw ancient magic and hermetic symbolisms as tools to reconnect with the spirit. While modern science found Bruno's occultism to be of little value, historians like Francis Yates argue that Bruno and the Hermetic tradition contributed to the imaginative leap that led to seeing the cosmos as boundless. The same mysticism that led Bruno to search the secrets of the Egyptians also emboldened him to declare the infinity of worlds. In Bruno's mind, magic, religion, philosophy, and science were threads of one tapestry. This Renaissance magus philosopher lived and died by that synthesis, refusing to abandon his combination of profound philosophy and somewhat willful contrariness, even under the threat of the stake. Giordano Bruno's most celebrated contributions lie in cosmology, the understanding of the structure of the universe. Bruno became known, especially in later centuries, as a visionary who, building on Copernicus, imagined a universe far more vast and varied than anyone had conceived before. To appreciate Bruno's cosmology, it's important to recall what most people of his era believed. Throughout the 1500s, the dominant model taught in universities and upheld by the church was the Ptolemaic Aristotelian cosmology, a geocentric universe. In this model, the spherical Earth rested at the center of creation, and around it rotated a series of concentric transparent spheres to which the heavenly bodies were attached. Nearest was the moon sphere, then Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the only known planets at the time, and finally the vast sphere of the fixed stars. This outermost star sphere marked the boundary of the universe. Beyond it was the spiritual realm. The stars were thought to be equidistant, all embedded in that single celestial shell. The cosmos was finite and closed like an onion of crystal layers. In 1543, Copernicus proposed a sun-centered arrangement of the planets. Copernicus's system still retained certain traditional features. He still used circular orbits and even spheres to some extent. He kept the idea of a sphere of fixed stars at the outer boundary, so the universe was still finite and closed in Copernicus's view. Copernicus did not suggest that the stars were other suns or that space was infinite. He merely swapped the positions of Earth and Sun and adjusted the orbits. Even this shift was controversial. It dethroned Earth from the center and had no immediate observational proof. During Bruno's youth, Copernican theory was slowly spreading among scholars but had not been accepted as fact. By the 1580s, many academics, especially in Catholic countries, still dismissed heliocentrism as an absurd or unproven hypothesis, often citing the lack of observed stellar parallax as Aristotle had. Into this atmosphere came Bruno, who embraced Copernicus with enthusiasm and then went much, much further. Bruno called Copernicus the dawn of the new era, but considered Copernican heliocentrism a mere beginning. If the Earth is not the center, Bruno reasoned, why should the Sun be the absolute center either? Copernicus had replaced Earth with the Sun as the fixed point and still imagined a firmament of stars enclosing the system. Bruno boldly abolished the firmament. He asserted that the stars are not lights on a crystal globe at a fixed distance, but rather innumerable distant suns scattered through space. Consequently, there could be no final boundary. Space extends infinitely in all directions. There is no single center of the universe. The center is everywhere, because from the perspective of any star, it looks like you're at the center of your own star system. Bruno wrote, there is no absolute up or down, no absolute location in space. The position of a body is relative to that of others. The observer is always at the center of things. This was a radical claim, essentially introducing the idea of relativity of motion and position, well before Galileo or Einstein, though Bruno framed it in qualitative terms. Bruno's infinite universe was filled with innumerable worlds. On the infinite universe and worlds, he insists that our sun is just one star among countless, and our Earth just one world among an infinity of worlds of the same kind as our own. He credited earlier thinkers for hints of this idea, notably the 15th century Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, who had written, "The universe has its center everywhere and circumference nowhere," and speculated about life on other stars. Bruno indeed called Cusa divine and saw him as a kindred spirit. Bruno also acknowledged the English astronomer Thomas Digges, who in 1576 had published a Copernican model with an infinite star-filled space. But Bruno's cosmology was more daring and comprehensive than either. He combined the infinity of space with a philosophical argument. An infinite God would naturally create an infinite reflection of himself, the universe. Bruno put it this way: the universe has no edge or limit because God's power is unlimited. The medieval idea of a cozy, well-ordered creation was, in Bruno's eyes, too constraining on God. Because Bruno's universe had innumerable suns, it's almost inevitably followed that there are innumerable Earths, planets like ours, orbiting those suns. And to Bruno, it seemed absurd to think Earth was the only world teeming with life. Why would an infinite God populate just one speck with life and leave all other worlds barren? Thus, Bruno became perhaps the first person in Western thought to argue for the plurality of inhabited worlds as a reality. He declared that other planets and worlds were no worse and no less inhabited than our Earth, as earlier noted. By doing so, Bruno implicitly raised profound theological questions. For example, if those other worlds had sentient beings, did they have their own Christs and their own incarnations? The Church was deeply troubled by this line of thought, and indeed, Bruno's belief in metempsychosis, reincarnation, and possibly transmigration of souls between worlds was one of the charges against him. Bruno seemed to entertain that souls might migrate or that each world might have its own forms of life destined for salvation or damnation, breaking the unique story of Christian redemption on earth. Bruno's cosmic pluralism was thus theologically explosive. In modern retrospect, Bruno's cosmological vision was remarkably ahead of its time. He essentially anticipated the Copernican principle taken to the extreme, that our position in the universe is not special. In the 19th century, Humboldt and others would praise Bruno for this plurality of worlds cosmology, and in the 20th to 21st century, as astronomers discovered exoplanets by the thousands, Bruno often gets credit as a prescient voice who guessed the vastness of the universe. However, it's crucial to remember Bruno's reasoning was not based on empirical observation. The telescope would not be invented until 1608, 8 years after his death. His arguments were philosophical and theological, rooted in ideas of infinity and perfection, as well as a dose of mystical intuition about the boundlessness of creation. Bruno wrote that with Copernicus, the gates of the sky were flung open, and we flew out to space, infinite and free. He truly imagined the universe that we know today, millions of galaxies with billions of suns. Though obviously he couldn't have had an inkling of this scale, he still thought in terms of stars and planets, not galaxies, as those concepts awaited later discovery. Bruno also made qualitative conjectures that foreshadow later science. For example, he surmised that space is essentially a vacuum, against Aristotle's assertion that nature abhors a vacuum, that stars vary in size, and that the twinkling of stars is due to their immense distance, a correct insight. He even mused that some stars might have dark companions, or that space is traversable in theory, science fiction ideas far ahead of his time. In On Cause, Principle, and Unity, Bruno states innumerable celestial bodies, no one of which is at the absolute center, fill the universe. Everywhere there is incessant relative change in position, the observer is always at the center. This conceptual leap won Bruno a place in the scientific pantheon for later generations, even though Bruno did not prove these things or even articulate them in a rigorous scientific way. Interestingly, Bruno combined his cosmology with an atomistic physics that was also ahead of its time in some ways. In his Latin works, he proposed that matter is made of indivisible minima or monads, essentially an atomic theory of matter and energy. He extended this to say there are no minimum particles of body, of spirit, and of quantity, like points, the atom of space. He suggested that matter can't be infinitely divided, a notion similar to ancient Greek atomism and later science. He also speculated that these atoms were in constant motion and transmutation. While Bruno's minima were more metaphysical abstractions than physical atoms, historians note that among the magic, Bruno's writings, contains some remarkable insights, including an atomic theory for matter. Modern commentators sometimes point out that Bruno's idea of countless worlds and perhaps countless living atoms resonates loosely with later developments, like the infinite universes of multiverse theory or the concept that matter and energy are quantized. However, Bruno did not develop quantitative laws or experiments, and his knowledge of mathematics was limited. In fact, Bruno disparaged the idea that nature could be explained by mere mathematics, a distinctly anti-Copernican stance on that point. For Bruno, geometry is for the physical, but the physical is sustained by the divine, meaning he never fully embraced the mathematical physics that became the hallmark of scientific revolution. This is why some historians, like Bertrand Russell, have been harsh, saying Bruno had fruitful intuitions lost in a disorder and was not a scientist per se. It is crucial to clarify a popular misconception. Bruno was executed primarily for his religious and philosophical heresies, not specifically for his cosmological views. In modern times, Bruno is often hailed as a martyr for science, implicitly comparable to Galileo. However, as the Vatican has since stressed, and as most historians agree, Bruno's trial focused on theological doctrines, the Trinity, the nature of God, and on magic and metaphysics, rather than on his belief that Earth moves. Heliocentrism was not yet an official heresy in 1600, the church would condemn it only in 1616 during Galileo's time. The inquisitors did reprimand Bruno for his plurality of worlds cosmology and infinite universe idea, and they listed it among his errors. But had that been Bruno's only deviation, he might have gotten off with a slap on the wrist. It was Bruno's pantheism, his denial of core Catholic dogmas, and his refusals to recant that ultimately led to his execution. As the Mac Tudor History of Mathematics biography notes, it is now generally recorded that Bruno was burned at the stake for his belief that the universe is infinite. But as we have seen, the whole affair was considerably more complicated than that. Bruno himself, by defending his philosophical positions as compatible with Christianity when the church insisted otherwise, almost seems to have challenged the Inquisition to try him. He was unwilling to capitulate. So while Bruno's cosmology was visionary, his death was the result of a collision with church authority on many fronts. In Bruno's mind, these fronts were all related. His infinite universe was part of an integrated heresy about God and nature, but the Inquisition was most threatened by the theological implications of his ideas. In retrospect, Bruno's cosmic ideas exerted a great influence on literature and philosophy, if not directly on the progression of science. In the 17th century, philosophers like Spinoza and Leibniz, who formulated monads, were arguably influenced by Bruno's bold blending of the infinite and the one. Poets and writers found inspiration in Bruno's vision of an endless universe. For example, in 1611, Shakespeare's contemporary John Donne wrote, "The new philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. It's all in pieces, all coherence gone," reflecting the unsettling impact of new cosmologies. Donne may have been alluding to Bruno's shattering of the crystalline spheres. Much later, 19th century science popularizes and secularists idolize Bruno as a prophet of modern astronomy. His universe was infinite, proclaimed an article in 1940, lauding Bruno's anticipation of cosmic pluralism. In the 1970s TV series, Cosmos, Carl Sagan famously dramatized Bruno's vision of the vast universe as a heroic flash of insight. In 2014, the updated Cosmos series again featured Bruno, portraying him as a lonely visionary of an infinite cosmos who was burned by an ignorant church. This portrayal drew some criticism from historians for oversimplification, but it shows how strongly Bruno's cosmic legacy endures. Even modern scientific institutions have paid tribute to Bruno. The SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, League gives out a yearly Giordano Bruno Memorial Award to individuals contributing to the search for alien life, a nod to Bruno's championing of innumerable Earths inhabited by living beings. And fittingly, a 22-kilometer-wide crater on the moon's far side is named Giordano Bruno, as are at least 2 asteroids. Bruno's ideas, once condemned, now ride through space. Giordano Bruno's legacy is multifaceted, spanning philosophy, science, literature, and even pop culture. Over the centuries since his death, he has been cast in various lights: heretic, martyr, visionary, madman. As one modern historian observed, history has not yet registered a stable appraisal for Giordano Bruno. Perceptions of Bruno were volatile enough in his lifetime, many have remained polarized to this day. In the 17th century, Baruch Spinoza developed a pantheistic philosophy where God is the substance of the universe, a concept very much like Bruno's notion of an infinite God immanent in nature. It's known that Spinoza read earlier heterodox thinkers. The similarity in their outlook is striking. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, too, may have been aware of Bruno's writings. Leibniz's theories of monads, soul-like fundamental units of reality, is somewhat reminiscent of Bruno's metaphysical atoms or monads. Leibniz mentions Bruno in some correspondences, though critically. The German idealist Schelling wrote an entire dialogue titled Bruno, or on the Natural and Divine Principle of Things in 1802, inspired by Bruno's life and ideas. In the 19th century, as the Romantic movement glorified rebels and visionaries, Bruno became a hero of free thought. In Italy's unification movement, idolized Bruno as a martyr who died for truth against tyranny. For instance, the Italian nationalist philosopher Giuseppe Mazzini often cited Bruno as a guiding spirit of intellectual liberty. Bruno's martyrdom resonated strongly with those seeking to challenge authoritarianism. The Catholic Church's reputation in the 19th century suffered, in part because of high-profile cases like Bruno's. He was held up as an example of the Church's persecution of science and thought. In 1889, when anti-clerical and liberal intellectuals erected a monument to Bruno in Rome, it was an international cause. Delegations from across Europe attended the unveiling, and speeches praised Bruno as a symbol of rational enlightenment triumphing over medieval obscurantism. This image of Bruno as a martyr of science and liberty persists in many popular accounts. The Catholic Church, on the other hand, has maintained a nuanced position. In 1942, the Vatican allowed a historian, Giovanni Mercati, to publish some of Bruno's trial documents, acknowledging the harshness of the execution but reaffirming that Bruno's theological errors were real. During the Millennial Jubilee year 2000, Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Angelo Sodona expressed profound sorrow for the harm done by the Inquisition, including Bruno's burning. However, the Vatican stopped short of rehabilitating Bruno's doctrines. Cardinal Sodano explicitly stated in 2000 that Bruno's ideas were incompatible with Christian belief. Effectively, the Church regretted the use of violence but did not retract Bruno's label as a heretic. Thus, Bruno remains a somewhat unresolved figure in Catholic memory, unlike Galileo, who was formally acknowledged as correct in his astronomy. Bruno's execution is often cited as a cautionary tale about religious intolerance. Today, he is regarded as an early advocate for intellectual freedom, a patron saint of free inquiry. Each year on February 17th in Rome, free thought organizations and citizens gather at Campo di Fiori under Bruno's monument to commemorate him and affirm the principle of freedom of expression. Bruno has also had an impact on modern alternative spiritualities. His blend of Hermetic mysticism and cosmic vision inspired members of the 19th century Theosophical Society and other occult or New Age thinkers. To them, Bruno was a martyr of the ancient wisdom tradition. Madame Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy, mentioned Bruno as one of those who kept the flame of esoteric truth burning. Bruno's writing on magic and the soul influenced 20th century scholars of Western esotericism like Francis Yates, whose book Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition from 1964 casts Bruno as a central figure linking Renaissance magic and the birth of modern science. In Yates's controversial thesis, it was Bruno's Hermetic imagination, his willingness to break the confines of classical thought, that helped open the way for scientific revolution. While not all historians agree with Yates's emphasis, her work certainly elevated Bruno's status in intellectual history and promoted deeper study of Renaissance occult philosophy. Today, Bruno is often referenced in discussions of pantheism and cosmic consciousness. For instance, some neo-pagan and pantheist groups honor Bruno as a saint who saw God in nature. The term cosmic religion, used by thinkers like Einstein to describe a spirituality rooted in the wonder of the universe, could well include Bruno as a predecessor. Bruno's famous line that God is not in one part of the universe more than in another was a radical reimagining of the divine, and it echoes today in spiritual naturalism. Bruno's dramatic life and bold ideas have captivated many artists and writers. The 19th century poets were especially drawn to him. We have Algernon Charles Swinburne, the English poet who wrote a fiery poem, The Monument of Giordano Bruno, in 1889 on the occasion of Bruno's statue being erected. In it, Swinburne hails Bruno as a hero of thought who foresaw a new age of reason. Another poet, Czesław Milosz of Poland, wrote the poem Campo di Fiori in 1943 during World War II, drawing a parallel between the indifference of people at Bruno's execution and the indifference of Warsaw citizens to the burning of the Jewish ghetto. Milosz imagines how on that day in 1600, as Bruno burned, the market square was full of ordinary life, flower sellers, fruit vendors, oblivious to the tragedy, much as people in 1943 Warsaw went about their lives while atrocities occurred. Bruno thus became a symbol in poetry for the loneliness of the victim and the callousness of society. James Joyce, one of the giants of 20th century literature, was fascinated by Bruno's idea, particularly Bruno's concept of the coincidence of opposites. Bruno believed that opposites ultimately converge, a very dialectical, mystical notion. Joyce, in Finnegan's Wake in 1939, makes many allusions to Bruno, often in punning form. He even names a pair of characters, Brown and Nolan, slyly referencing Bruno the Nolan from Nola and playing on Brown and Nolan as a distortion of Bruno's name. In a letter, Joyce wrote, "His philosophy is kind of a dualism. Every power in nature must evolve an opposite in order to realize itself, and opposition brings reunion." This Brunan and Hegelian idea underpins a lot of Joyce's complex wordplay in Finnegan's Wake. Joyce arguably saw himself and his work reflected in Bruno's incessant word-splitting and joining. So Bruno has a discreet but significant presence in one of the most challenging novels of modernist literature. In the realm of fiction, Bruno has outright been a character. A notable example is the series of historical mystery novels by S.J. Paris, pseudonym of Stephanie Merritt, beginning with Heresy from 2010, which imagines Giordano Bruno as a sleuth solving murders in Elizabethan England while on the run from the Inquisition. These books, blending fact and fiction, introduce Bruno to a wide popular audience as a sort of Renaissance detective, complete with his Nolan wit and learned tricks. Earlier, in 1973, an Italian-French film, Giordano Bruno, was released, directed by Giuliano Montaldo and starring Gian Maria Volonté as Bruno. The film portrays Bruno's wanderings and trials with considerable historical accuracy and a sympathetic lens. It emphasizes Bruno's defiance and shows scenes of him debating in Venice and suffering in prison, culminating in a haunting execution scene. The film helped to humanize Bruno and won critical acclaim for Volenté's passionate performance. In music, Bruno's words and story have also found expression. In 1878, the French composer Camille Saint-Saëns composed an oratio, Les Deluges, in which a section was reportedly inspired by Bruno's vision of the infinite universe. The German composer, Hans Werner Henze, in 1968 wrote a large choral piece, New Praises of the Infinite, using Bruno's text as libretto. This piece, premiered in 1970, is a cantata for chorus, orchestra, and soloists that sets some of Bruno's Italian poems to music, praising the infinite universe and the divine found in nature. In the world of opera, contemporary composer Francesco Filade premiered an opera Giordano Bruno in 2015 in Porto, Portugal. This opera dramatizes Bruno's trial, incorporating his actual words from trial records and writings and reflecting on themes of free thought, effectively turning Bruno's life into a modern musical tragedy. Even popular music has a Bruno connection, and this from even one of my favorite songs and one of my favorite bands. In 2016, the American rock band Avenged Sevenfold released a song called Roman Sky about Bruno's execution. The music video shows imagery of Bruno and includes voiceovers about his life, presenting him as a martyr who looked at the stars. In heavy metal and progressive rock circles, Bruno's name occasionally appears. For instance, there's an Italian progressive rock band named Il Bacchio della Medusa with an album referencing Bruno. This shows how Bruno's narrative, the man who saw the truth in the stars and was killed for it, has permeated various cultural niches. Bruno's confrontational style at Oxford meant he didn't win converts among English academics. However, Bruno's presence in England did leave some ripples. Bruno's dedication of 2 books to Philip Sidney suggests Sidney and his circle absorbed some of Bruno's ideas on ethics and the art of memory. Sidney's own writings on poetry and virtue, while not obviously Brunan, were about ennobling the soul, a concept Bruno championed. It's been speculated by some literary scholars that Bruno's visit might have indirectly influenced William Shakespeare. This is highly speculative, but some have noted that Shakespeare's late play, The Tempest, in 1611, has an infinite magical cosmology and a character named Prospero, who, like Bruno, has a book of magic and is exiled by the Inquisition. Prospero is a magician duke based from Milan, which some read as an allegory partly referencing figures like Bruno or Dee. Francis Yates argued that Bruno's visit influenced the development of the School of Night, a shadowy group of English intellectuals like Sir Walter Raleigh, the mathematician Thomas Harriot, and perhaps Christopher Marlowe, who were interested in occult philosophy and Copernican theory. Harriot, for instance, became one of the first telescopic astronomers in England and an advocate for Copernicus, and he actually observed the moon with a telescope around the same time as Galileo. We have no evidence Bruno met Harriot, but it's possible Bruno's Copernican zeal inspired those in Raleigh's circle to take up the new astronomy. Some historians, however, caution that the School of Night as a formal group is more legend than fact. Nonetheless, Bruno's English sojourn did plant seeds. It put advanced ideas into circulation and proved that even in a Protestant land, his radical brand of thinking was controversial. Remember that George Abbott, who lampooned Bruno's Copernicism, later played a role in the trial of Galileo. The chain of influence is indirect but noteworthy. In modern times, Bruno's connection to England has been commemorated through fiction and through English translations of his works which became available starting in the 19th century. The poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, an English romantic, mentioned Bruno in his essay A Defense of Poetry as someone who paid the price for his genius. Shelley, a critic of religion, admired Bruno's defiance. Thus, Bruno became part of the English romantic imagination of the tragic persecuted genius. Bruno is often regarded by scholars as one of the last and boldest figures of the Italian Renaissance. He carried Renaissance Platonism and Hermeticism to their extreme logical conclusions. An infinite cosmos, an exalted role for human reasons, the unity of art and science, the breakdown of old authorities. In doing so, he also helped usher in the early modern age. Some call him an early modern for his cosmology and his insistence on following reason over doctrine. Others call him an ultra-Renaissance man for his syncretic blending of disciplines. Bruno didn't invent a machine or a physical theory that directly led to an invention. What he did invent, in a sense, was a new way of thinking about the world. The universe as a liberated, infinite expanse governed by infinite divine laws with an equivalently liberated human mind capable of grasping it. This expansive vision influenced how later people conceived the human place in the cosmos, arguably an invention of the modern mindset. Bruno's figurative fingerprints can be found in works of later inventors of ideas. For instance, Galileo knew of Bruno's fate and was cautious in how he presented Copernicism. But Galileo's writings occasionally echo Bruno's in seeing sunspots or mirrored stars as evidence against celestial perfection. Did Bruno influence Galileo directly? Unlikely in terms of content. Galileo did not need Bruno to adopt heliocentrism. But Bruno's martyrdom was a warning that Galileo heeded until 1633 when he even fell victim. In that respect, Bruno indirectly affected how scientific ideas were debated. The lesson being, avoid theological entanglements, or Bruno's end awaits. In the grand scheme, Giordano Bruno's life and work form a bridge between the Renaissance world of magic and the modern world of science. He was not fully of either, yet he partook of both. Today, the Giordano Bruno Foundation in Germany carries his name as it advocates evolutionary humanism, a worldview combining scientific understanding with humanist ethics. This foundation, founded in 2004, is explicitly anti-dogmatic and uses Bruno's legacy as a rallying symbol for free thought and secularism. It funds projects and publications critiquing religious fundamentalism and promoting a scientific outlook on the world. If a 16th century monk could become the namesake of a 21st century secular humanist organization that testifies to the enduring power of Bruno's story. For centuries after his death, Giordano Bruno's ideas and fate still spark reflection and debate. He stands as a warning of the perils of suppressing ideas, and as an inspiration to those who champion intellectual freedom. The bronze statue of Bruno in Rome's Campo di Fiori, erected in 1889, bears an inscription in Italian that reads, "To Bruno, the century predicted by him, here where the fire burned." Those words capture how 19th century admirers saw him, a man who foresaw the future. Indeed, Bruno foretold a coming era in which the infinite universe he imagined is largely accepted as reality, and the freedom to think he died for is a core value. Giordano Bruno, the Nolan, spent his life pursuing truth as he saw it, with the infinite universe as his guide. His lectures and debates took him across Europe. His wanderings spread radical seeds in many soils. While he neither built telescopes nor formulated physics, Bruno ignited minds with the idea that the cosmos was boundless and that no authority should curtail the search for knowledge. That flame, lit by Bruno's writings and by the example of his death, has never been extinguished. It continues to burn in our collective cultural memory as a symbol of courageous inquiry in the face of oppression. Bruno's universe was not mathematical like Galileo's or mechanical like Newton's. It was alive, soaked in divinity. He saw the stars not as cold, fixed points, but as radiant souls whispering their secrets. He saw the magician not as a charlatan, but as the one who remembers the original language of the cosmos, the words before words. In Bruno's cosmos, to think was to invoke, to imagine was to create, and to love the infinite was the highest form of madness. We walk now in the future he foretold, where the stars are countless, the planets many, and the center no longer ours. But even in our age of dark matter and data, his voice still speaks. It challenges us to remember what's been forgotten, that the pursuit of truth is holy, that the universe is stranger than doctrine, and that fire cannot kill a soul in love with the infinite. So to the memory of Giordano Bruno, Dominican defector, cosmic visionary, heretic, and martyr, we dedicate this episode, not to canonize him, but to summon him back to the circle, because in the echo of the flames, beneath the dome of endless stars, we find him still speaking, and we're still listening.